Good evening and welcome to Face to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Wijetilleke. With me this evening is Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, no stranger to our viewers, who represents the SJB, and he is the special advisor on political economy to the leader of the SJB. Welcome and good evening, Kusum.
Nice to have you. Thanks for having me again.
Right. So, Kusum, let's discuss now political economy. That's very broad. But when you look at it, the economy is about people. It's about Sri Lankans. And right now, over the last several years, millions of Sri Lankans fell below the poverty line. And it's easy to dump people below the poverty line. You just wreck the nation's finances and that will happen. But it's very difficult to move them back up because you can't simply be handing out, loads of money and that doesn't bring them up in life. That's a temporary solution. So how do we set about this? I mean, it is right now the issue with this government, which is trying its best, but in the end you need economic growth. So how do we set about this? Because we need to have these people come up out of poverty as fast as possible.
Thank you, Niresh. Well, thanks for having me on your show. And I think you asked the question basically about political economy and about poverty, right? So I think the first thing to ask is, why is it necessary to reduce poverty? Why can't we just have poverty? Someone can easily ask you and say, poverty and inequality is a normal impact and effect and outcome of an economic system. You will always have poverty. You will always have some level of inequality. They will say this is the way all over the world, so we don't have to manage this, right? So political economy is actually what the subject of economics used to be called prior to its modern incarnation. So if you look at the 18th century, even up to the late 19th century, you don't have a subject called economics. What you have is political economy. And the idea of political economy is really rooted in British philosophers. So Adam Smith essentially is a political philosopher. And the idea is that you don't have economics on its own. So I think something I'd like to impress upon your audience is that nowadays when people talk about economics, they consider economics to be a mathematical subject. They think it's like the laws of physics. So there are right and wrong answers in economics, according to the modern incarnation. The reality is that economics has never really been value neutral. Economics is essentially a way of showing your values through a process of economic policy. So if you take, for example, Adam Smith is the father of modern economic thought. And his book, The Wealth of Nations, is considered to be one of the foundational texts of the subject. If you look at Adam Smith's other famous book, it was called Moral Sentiments. So Moral Sentiments was the precursor to his Wealth of Nations book. And in Moral Sentiments, as the name suggests, he talks about these moral implications of economics. So as you said, you need to grow, right, to get rid of poverty. So let's take, for example, Angola. You've heard of Angola in Africa. During the 1990s, Angola had about 10% GDP growth for about 10 years. But after that 10-year period, what you found was 3/4 of the population still living in abject poverty. There was virtually no improvement in mortality. There was no improvement in child mortality, education levels, access to health, none of those things. But you had, a decade of economic growth. Similar to that, if you consider Equatorial Guinea also had, it went from something like $300 GDP per capita in 1990 to about $10,000 by 2010. But yet you found I think in 2010, the average or the age of mortality was about 58, if I'm not mistaken. So you're essentially seeing economic growth with no improvement in how long people live, which is a pretty basic human development indicator. So in this sense, political economy is trying to understand how best we can make economic policy work for the people, right? So it's about the interaction between a political system and economic policy and how it impacts the society at large. So when you ask the question in terms of modern economics, you can see, for example, on Google, the frequency of the word economics only really started in the, let's say mid 19th century, early 20th century. Before that, it was called political economy, and it was called that for a reason, because we have to understand that economic policy on its own, unless you understand a broader version of things, you're not really going to get the desired outcome. So that's part of the thinking behind this subject of political economy. If I were to just touch on the poverty angle, as I discussed, I think if you have growth, it's not just about growth, it's about development. So, and development has a redistributive angle, because I think automatically it's something called the Kuznets curve in economics, where that this neoclassical branch of economics considers that, for example, as an economy grows, inequality reduces. And that is true for a certain extent. But in economics, in the subject, it's a nice U curve. It's a very smooth sort of curve. But in reality, when you really map out the actual empirical evidence, it's more of a wave sort of thing. So you see little bits of inequality improving, then you see it suddenly crashing, then you see it improving again. So the issue with, I think, most of the last century in terms of economics is that we've seen a lot of boom and bust cycles. So really another thing that political economy is trying to do is to try to smooth these cycles, because it's not good for business, it's not good for society, and it's also not good for planning our communities and societies ahead, because if you're always worried about a boom bust, you're not going to plan for the future. So that's another reason why political economy is really important in a modern context.
Now, Kusum, what you were describing, basically, you're talking about reducing inequality and improving all the social development indicators. So these are the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN for all countries, and for different countries, the measurements were, each country has its measurements, and each country was measured back in, I think, 2016. Even before that, at the turn of the millennium, it was called the Millennium Development Goals. Now it's the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
But each country has to move forward towards its targets. So, I mean, I think it's on a scale of 100%. So you have your health, education, energy, transportation, all these different sectors with goals. And of course, Sri Lanka had its goals, and then in 2022, all the progress we made went out the window because we crashed. I mean, the entire country crashed. There was no question of spending more money on hospitals or education or anything, because the government was bankrupt. So there was very little money to spend. So everything pretty much went backwards. Not every indicator in the SDGs, but many of them. So now we are trying to regain things, aren't we? But how do we speed this up?
Well, Neeraj, I think the first thing we have to accept is that inequality is not a peripheral issue. Inequality is a pretty central economic issue. And it's not something that's going to be solved on its own. It's that, as if a policymaker says, oh, if our economy grows at 6-7%, poverty will reduce. Yes, absolute poverty might reduce. Inequality doesn't necessarily reduce. That requires real policy and real distributive policies, right? Now, the idea, if you talk about redistribution, we consider this idea of, because when you think of reducing poverty, we just think of redistributing wealth. So we think it's a handout culture. So again, I come back to the moral aspect of it, okay? Yes, there is a moral imperative. Yes, you don't want to see your neighbor starve. You don't want to see crime on the street because of poverty. You don't want a community full of desperate people. Yes, that's a moral standing, yes. But you would also immediately recognize that if a society has these traits, it's going to be very difficult for you to survive. Now, back in the day, it would be a question of real survival, right? Whether society is going to eat you up, whether society is going to rob you, take your property. Now, because of hundreds of years of this development of something called the social contract, we now have this understanding in our society that it's good for everybody if the children down this road are educated. It's good for my entire street if there are more houses being built, because it increases the value of my house, because it increases the value of our town. So it's a more holistic way of thinking. And if we don't consider, look at inequality in this way, there's a mathematical guarantee that our living standards, the living standards of the middle class, will start to collapse. So this is something that's very important to understand, that inequality is not something that you can say it's on the periphery and we can just relax and look up and wait. Because the fact of the matter is, if there is very low growth or stagnating growth, if there is very high levels of inequality and already a relatively high concentration of wealth, what happens is those concentrations of wealth only increase with inequality. When the concentrations of wealth increase at the top, the middle class starts diluting. And when the middle class becomes diluted, people's living standards start falling, right? So I read the World Food Program had a report from 2024, from last year. And they talked about, there's two ways that people go about protecting this. So when there's food insecurity, you make one of two choices. You make more of a lifestyle structural change, which is dangerous. You might pawn some of your jewelry. You might take a second job. Taking a second job has social impacts at home. Maybe you have a husband or a wife, maybe you have a child. So there are secondary impacts. You may go in for high interest borrowing because you can't afford it. These are structural impacts. Or you may eat less food, right, to survive. So I found in this report that it's something like 40% of people are basically going into making structural changes to put food on the table. And about 50% are basically, skipping meals, reducing the amount of protein they take, saving it for another day, that sort of thing. These are not the kind of indicators that you can quickly change, because as you know, as we've noticed in the last 2 years, just because you keep giving someone aswasuma every month, it doesn't take them out of poverty. It only helps them maintain a certain level where they're not going to go into absolute poverty. So aswasuma is designed in such a way as it's a cash handout and it's extremely necessary, and without it people will struggle to even survive. But it is not a means of poverty reduction. It is not going to be a long-term, and the idea of samurdhi, for instance, which aswasuma comes from, samurdhi was never designed as a forever handout. It's become a generational thing where from one family it goes down to the other family. That was never, welfare is never designed in that manner. Welfare is designed as a way of helping you move out of poverty and making you self-sustainable, and it's like a stopgap in between. Now, can we reasonably assume that anybody receiving aswasuma has the capabilities to improve their skills, to get another qualification, to find a new job? No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is people take aswasuma, survive month to month, and hope for the best. So you can see how this cycle traps a certain segment of society, and that segment of society is only growing. And as it grows, in Colombo, we will feel it. Now, the Aragalaya was a man-made disaster, right? But the man-made disaster that initially impacted the farmers and the teachers and the working class, it eventually impacted all of us sitting here. There was no point if you had a luxury apartment because there was no gas or electricity. There's no point if you have money to spend at the mall. You can't even get near the malls because there was a riot and the whole of GGG was a campsite, right? So we understand now, post-Aragalaya, the impacts of inequality and poverty, and sudden spikes in both of those, it leads to long-term impacts. And those long-term impacts, it's not just about increasing social spending. It's not just about better targeting aswasuma. It's about finding a way to grow and have the benefits of that growth filter down to as many people as possible. And luckily, Niresh, there is plenty of evidence for this happening in our region, in our generation. In this period that we've lived in, plenty of countries have achieved this. Pretty much every country that's in the news these days have achieved this. So it's really up to policymakers to study those countries, to see what policies they have used, to see what kind of social indicators they have kept as their objectives and what they have reached. And that's how we have to plan things. So what I see right now is an absence of such a plan, because I think we are sort of in this mode where we think if we meet the intended targets of the IMF, that all these other problems below it will be solved. That if we meet the intended targets and the...
But the IMF program wasn't designed for poverty alleviation.
But if you listen to our politicians, growth. That's how they seem to have conceived of this IMF program.
I mean, the IMF program is a program to ensure that the government and the country survive, that it doesn't fall into even more chaos, that it's a program intended to slowly bring the country out of this. It will not alleviate poverty. It's not going to bring us 6%, 7% economic growth. That's up to us to achieve. And now, Kusum, you mentioned several measures that households take when they are in dire straits. And when you were mentioning them, I was just thinking, half the population of this country,
Yes.
I would guess, or more than half, I think the statistics bear witness to this, more than half actually had to go through that, reducing the amount of food, borrowing at high interest rates, pawning whatever they could. I mean, forget the gold jewelry. It was, pawning whatever they could from their homes, and so on. There were so many measures which you mentioned, which more than half the population had to do. And so it's not just about the poverty level. I mean, I think officially about 25% of Sri Lankans fell below the poverty line in 2022 and 2023. But there are so many, or just as many, I would think, who are above the poverty line, but they are not doing well. They're just barely making ends meet, basically. I mean, the poverty line is $3 a day. That's the World Bank standard. That just ensures that you're not going to starve. But it's much more than that, isn't it? And this is Sri Lanka. This is not some dirt poor sub-Saharan state which has nothing but but a lot of desert. This is the land of milk and honey. Why in the world we fell into this? Well, we all know. But how do we get back out? And what measures do we need to take?
Okay, so just to touch on the poverty statistics, the World Bank from last year, their report suggested 25% live below the poverty line. The poverty line, as per the Census and Statistics Department, and also as per the World Bank, is roughly 16,900 rupees monthly. Now, I'll leave it up to your audience if you think that is enough money to survive on 16,900. It's basically the survival rate. So remember that when we are talking about this poverty line, it's basically the survival line. And we understand there is so much more to the human experience and humanity than just about surviving to your next meal, right? If you take the Center for Poverty Analysis household survey from last year, and the Center for Poverty Analysis, there was another survey they did in 2023 in conjunction with the World Bank. So together, these reports suggest that even though the World Bank says 25% below the poverty line, that comes to about 5.5 million people below the poverty line. But there is no high. It's not that you live just below the poverty line, you're in poverty, and just above the poverty line, everything's great. Even 5%, 10%, 20% above the poverty line, also you're still struggling. So I think that CEPA household report from 2024 suggested that something like between 8 to 10 million Sri Lankans are classified as poor. So that's just about, on the upper end, that's just about half the population. And if you're on the low end, it's 8 million Sri Lankans, which is an enormous number of people. And what's really important to understand is not that this 8 million people on its own is a problem, but it's that it was only 3 million people a few years ago.
Absolutely. It's pretty
more
much
than double.
It's more than doubled during 2022, 2023.
And this
especially
creates a different issue, right? It's not just about absolute poverty, it's that poverty of aspiration, because you were formerly comfortable member of the lower middle class, maybe even a member of the middle class. Maybe you had middle class aspirations, upper middle class aspirations. All that is gone. And that leaves behind a certain resentment and a certain anger.
Absolutely. Now, what you're saying is, for example, you had a motorcycle, but you lost your job, so you had to sell your motorcycle or pawn it or whatever. And then you're riding a push cycle. So then your aspirations you were aspiring earlier to buying a small car, but now you're back to a bicycle.
You have no aspiration.
Yeah. So then, it's a sense of hopelessness.
Yes, there's nothing more dangerous than, a large group of people with no hope, with no aspiration. This is where the anger and the resentment comes from. This is how riots start, and you have political upheaval. So, as I keep saying, inequality, concentrations of wealth, poverty, these are not just social issues. They will eventually become very serious economic issues. Now, there's two ways you attack poverty. One is you provide people a certain flow so that they don't fall into extreme poverty. So you ensure they have a certain number of meals, a certain nutritional balance in there. You have access to school, access to healthcare, because these are things that cost money, right?
But that is the social welfare side.
The social welfare side. But remember that to come out of poverty, you need these things. You need, for example, an education. And that education cannot be, I pass my O-levels, because that's no longer going to be very useful to you. It's no longer enough to say I have my A-levels. It's no longer useful, because you're no longer just competing with people from Sri Lanka, right? You're competing now essentially in a global labor force. Especially when you go to these jobs that require a higher studies, you still need better than you did before, because you're now competing with kids in India, kids in Bangladesh, because jobs are now mobile. They're moving all over the place. So you have to be even more qualified than you did before. Instead, what do we have? We have crumbling school systems, crumbling health systems. So how are people supposed to move up? I think there's this idea that poverty is the result of lazy people. That poverty is because people are poor. People are poor because they're lazy. So we have to dispel this myth, right? Poverty is not the result of someone's personal attitude, personal will. It's about the structures that are available in your society, in your community. Are they allowing you to obtain the necessary skills to get yourself and your family out of poverty? This is what policy is supposed to do. But of course, if you take Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, all these countries, when they entered their phase of growth, and they started improving their exports, they also started fortifying their social nets. And countries like Singapore on one end of the spectrum, where they don't necessarily have, I don't think they have what's called unemployment insurance. But if you don't have a job, there are enough mechanisms to help you find a new job. There are retraining mechanisms. For example, Malaysia had this thing called a compulsory savings, where if you're getting a cash handout, they make it in a way that you have to save a small percentage of that. Then there are other conditional transfers, where if you get a benefit, you have to ensure that your child has a certain number of days in school where there's no absenteeism. So the state is requiring something of you in order to get this. Now, there might be some that study welfare that say this is not an ideal situation. I think for a country like ours that doesn't have the fiscal space, you should perhaps look at some kind of conditionality towards these welfare projects, because you need people to have a buy-in, right? So from whether it's Brazil, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Singapore, all these countries have had social safety nets, welfare states. Don't let anybody tell you that Singapore is a country that came up without social welfare. Just go and take a look at the facts. That's not what's happening. And the other aspect is, Neeraj, you have to grow, right? So what is Sri Lanka's growth plan? Usually, a country like Sri Lanka needs an external sector and a diversified, advanced external sector. And I have discussed this with you on this program, that I think about 6 months ago, we were talking about how this government doesn't have any plan for its exports. It doesn't have an industrial plan. It doesn't seem to have any plan of liberalizing trade further. Now, the Trump tariffs we talked about, the Trump tariffs have come, we have negotiated, they have reduced the tariffs. Sri Lanka is a pretty stubborn negotiator, right? Because I'm not sure what we've actually let go of in this negotiation. I don't see any major reductions in para-tariffs. I don't see any reductions in non-trade barriers. I don't see any major liberalization of trade. It's almost as if we have reacted to Trump, gotten a reduction, and now we're happy. I mean, that's not policy, right? You have to have an idea of what your trading relationship with the rest of the world has to be. And for you to have that, you have to have some long-term economic objectives. So Sri Lanka, one of our long-term economic objectives has to be to enter into these global value chains, supply chains, so that when you build an iPhone or a vehicle or a laptop, some small part of this manufacturing process happens locally. And over time, you expect local companies to develop, to grow, to learn from those other companies, to develop an ecosystem locally so that we can start supplying them, so that you don't drive imports up. Because, for example, with tourism, the dependency on tourism also drives imports, because tourists come and they consume imports here. we have Lion beer, but almost everything else is imported, right? So hotel supplies, most of it is imported. If you want to build more rooms, most of that stuff is imported. If you want to construct something, a restaurant, it's imported. So remember, that's the reason between services. That's why service exports like tourism is different to industrial exports, because there's more value add locally. Whereas with especially the kind of tourism that we have, there's very little value add. So there's very little foreign exchange retained in the island. The margins are small. So in that sense, we have to have an industrial policy, even if you believe that Sri Lanka's economic future is completely service dominated. Even if you believe that we can survive completely on tourism and remittances, a very bad idea, but let's say that's what you assume. You still need to improve, diversify, and develop your export sector, because most of the countries around the world have some, who are successful countries, have some level of advanced industrial exports, which Sri Lanka just doesn't have. We only have auto components, and I think some of the apparel companies have what I call high technology exports, but majority of it is not. I think it's like 0.2% of our total exports.
Right. So let's get into the industrial side of things. But first we need to take a short commercial break. I'm in conversation with Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
GDP around $30,000 billions, 30,000, but in Sri Lankan context, we are just only 80 billions.
And one of the economic principle also say, with the trade, everybody better off.
Now, why he has reduced 44 to 30? That's what my point is all about, right? He's not playing kind of a trade game with us.
Now only the government, we are seeing that the provincial council election has completed and the people are appointed, but now only the infrastructure projects are being, the money is being deployed.
Face the Nation every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
පුතේ සමහර මිනිස්සුන්ගේ හිත ඇතුලේ තියෙන ප්‍රශ්න ගැන කියන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ ඒගොල්ලෝගේ වචන වලින් විතරක් නෙවෙයි. ඒගොල්ලෝගේ ඇස් වලිනුත් ඒගොල්ලෝගේ හිතේ තියෙන දේවල් කියව ගන්න පුළුවන්. මුළු ජීවිත කාලෙම ඔයව බලාගෙන ඔයගේ ළඟින් ඉන්න එක විතරයි මට දැන් කරන්න ඕනේ.
ඌ සනීප වෙලා ඉක්මනට අලු ගසලා දාලා එන්න කලින් අපි මේ වැඩේ ඉක්මනට ඉවරයක් කළා දාන්න.
අපි දැන් කල්පනා කරන්න ඕනේ ඔය ඩේවිඩ් කියන එකාට අපේ පවුලත් එක්ක තියෙන එරියස්සේ මොහොතේ කියලා.
Rocky Chapter 2 හෙට රාත්‍රී 8ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with my guest, Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke. Now, Kusum, we started with the poverty alleviation side, but in the end, it's not about handouts, whether you call it aswasuma or whatever. That's just keeping people going. But to lift them up in life, you need to give them jobs, and good jobs, not just, they can't be doing the same jobs that their ancestors were doing 200 years ago. The girl who works in a garment factory aspires to do something more in life. She can't just be working in that apparel firm, till she retires. So you need people to have the opportunity to go for better jobs, better paying jobs as well. So now Sri Lanka, we don't seem to have a particular focus on the industries that we should be trying to start up here or to bring in. President Ranasinghe Premadasa, of course, came up with the 300 garment factory program, highly successful. And that's where, he basically laid it down that this country is going to go into the apparel sphere in a big way. And it worked. But we haven't seen that kind of focus from any government after Mr. Premadasa, really. There have been bits and pieces here and there, and even now people say, the IT industry is something we should get into. But how do we really figure out what we want to do and what would be good for us to do.
Niresh, I'm glad that you mentioned the 89 to 93 period. As a member of the SJB, I think if I bring up the 89 to 93 period, some will say that I'm trying to glorify the former President Ranasinghe Premadasa and his period. As you know, there are many negative connotations as well to this period in Sri Lanka's history.
Oh, absolutely.
With regard to, it was a very bloody period. There was an insurrection,
Absolutely.
There was a war in the north. And it's not a period that you look back on history and say this was an amazing time for us.
No,
but
it was a very testing
it was
time.
a very difficult time for us. A lot of people lost their lives.
As a journalist, from
I'm
that
sure
time,
you
I
can,
can tell you it was the most terrible time for the media.
I'm sure you have the scars
absolutely.
Yes.
But that doesn't take away from the fact that we're still relying on this 300
yes, and I
garment
think
factory program.
It's so important to realize that this 89-93 period is actually quite unique in the development history of our region, not just in Sri Lanka. There's plenty of studies. I think there's Dr. Saman Kallegama, who's fairly well-known Sri Lankan academic, Dr. David Dunn, Srimal Abhiratna. I think there's quite a few very, very famous economists that have discussed and written and made their submissions on this subject. This was a period where we saw rapid economic growth, diversification of an export base, and as you mentioned, the introduction of a whole new sector to a country, as well as simultaneously improving social indicators. What usually happens is when you have these periods of these spikes of very large growth, you also have these liberalization tends to lead to inequality, as we mentioned before. During this 89-93 period, when people studied it 10, 15, 20 years later, they found that, interestingly, while we had this growth, we also had an upliftment of people. So that growth somehow was designed in such a way that it started at the rural parts of Sri Lanka and then filtered down. It built new companies, local companies that started becoming suppliers to those multinationals. You had these programs such as, I think some would be the Janasavya program, the housing development program. These were all done in conjunction, right? Because they understood, policymakers at the time understood that growth on its own is not going to be adequate unless you lift people up, because during that, this was a time when the economic strife was felt very acutely, right? This is why there was so much, the southern insurrection, people must understand it wasn't just political. There was a huge economic basis to it, right? People were really, the liberalization of 1977, people found that it didn't really reach them. The economic benefits didn't reach them. And that's why 7, 8, 9 years later, you still had this uprising. So we have to understand that it's not just growth, it's not just development, it has to be equitable. And that comes from institutions. Now, institution building is something that we're really quite poor in Sri Lanka, but institution building is important for both poverty and for growth. For example, with Japan, you had the Ministry of Technology and Trade, MITI, right? I think there was something similar in South Korea as well. The South Korean government didn't just do these public-private partnerships. The South Korean government went out and purchased intellectual property. They gave out soft loans. They invested in research and development facilities. All of this, South Korea's emergence right now as a major economic power, it's an economy that's bigger than Spain. This has happened in our lifetime. In the 1970s, 80s, South Korea was not a thing. K-pop was not a thing. K-beauty was unheard of. Hyundai was not a company, right? Kia was not a company. This has all happened in our generation. 20 years ago, if someone drove a Hyundai, you wouldn't take it seriously. Today, there's a Hyundai Jeep worth about 40 million rupees. That is what you call progress. Now, if for example, the policymakers in Korea had sat around and said, our comparative advantage is commodities and agriculture, and let's specialize in commodities and let's give our farmers a bigger subsidy, and they wouldn't have a Hyundai today. Hyundai is a company that the government invested in, propped up, gave it about 10 years, protected the car market. They even exercised protectionism in their economic policy. But today, South Korea is one of the most liberalized economies in the world because they took those steps. They didn't just go try to climb from one step straight to the other. They built step by step, and today they are competing with Toyota, which is a 50, 60, 70-year-old company. So this is where other countries in our region have taken these steps, but Sri Lanka isn't learning from them, and that's what worries me. What worries me is not the lack of a plan. That is worrying. What worries me is that we don't seem to be taking any examples from anywhere in the world. Our only idea seems to be, we should plug ourselves into India because India is growing. I said, okay, that's great, but then why don't we study why is Karnataka growing? Why is the state of Tamil Nadu growing so quickly? What are the specific, how have they been able to attract Apple iPhone manufacturing, Foxconn? They manufacture iPhones now in India. So are you telling me that the demographics of India is so different to the demographics of Sri Lanka that Sri Lankans are so backward that we'll never be able to, that these things are not true, right? We know that Sri Lankans that go abroad are some of the most successful people in their companies. We know how many of them work for NASA, how many of them do high technology jobs, the networks they have. Unless we make use of these things, more people are just going to keep leaving and nobody's really going to come back. And this is the other thing. A large part of our economy depends on shipping people abroad and hoping that they send back some money. I mean, does that sound like a good economic plan to you?
It certainly does not. Because in the end, many of those people will migrate for good. And then they lose touch with the connection with Sri Lanka because they take their entire family and their parents might also join them, or their parents will, when they die, then there's no connection anymore with Sri Lanka.
And before that happens, Niresh, if before that happens, before a Sri Lankan has lived abroad for 30, 40 years, his kids are schooling there, his children will never want to return. Before you get to that point, you need to build something here that will attract them back.
Absolutely.
They have
but we failed to do that.
We've never done that. We've never done that.
I mean, I think for the past nearly 50 years, we've been sending our people overseas, and the promise is that, their money will be used well here, and that there'll be a better Sri Lanka to come back to. But then that doesn't happen.
Niresh, it's not just about the lower income bracket and the unskilled labor, right? For example, my father moved to England in the mid 60s. He moved again to Dubai in the mid 80s. My brother, I have an older brother who's never lived in Sri Lanka. He's lived abroad for most of his life. There's a very good chance my father would not have come back to Sri Lanka. And I remember him always talking about how he was under a lot of pressure to stay in Dubai at the time in the 80s, because people were asking, why are you leaving such a big salary and coming back to Sri Lanka? The prospects are good for you. But for whatever reason, my father decided to come back to Sri Lanka. But like him, in his generation, there have been thousands of Sri Lankans that never, and the thing is...
Well, for every one Sri Lankan who comes back, how many more don't come back?
And what happens even in the example of my father and so many other people that we know, when you work abroad, even if it's 5 years, even if it's 10 years, you learn a lot. And you see a different market, you see a different way of working.
Yes.
And then you come back to Sri Lanka and you bring back these skills, you bring back this expertise. That's what we need. We need people. We have no problem with people going abroad and earning a living, but you have to give them some reason to come back. You have to give them something here that has to attract them. They have to be able to think that if I go back to Sri Lanka, I can apply my skills and I can develop something, and I don't need to depend on, it doesn't have to matter who I know, who my connections are, that I need to have money to bribe someone. No, you should be able to find capital. You should be able to find people who have the necessary qualifications to work in your company. Those are things that the government has to play a part in, right? People aren't automatically going to go into STEM fields. That's why every other developing country has put in incentives for STEM education, because they understood that STEM and STEAM were important. In Sri Lanka, we are still talking about these things. So
now, every government that I can remember has made this appeal: Sri Lankans living overseas, come back here, work hard here and help the country to develop. Every single regime has done that, but it doesn't work that way. You will move back if you feel that you can earn a decent living, your kids can do well here. They're not going to sacrifice everything you have in that other country and move back here. Unless you have, some relatives here, your parents are here, something like that. But otherwise, if there is no real reason to come back, you're not going to come back. Because most Sri Lankans who are living overseas are doing better overseas than they would if they were here.
Actually, one of the SJB's policies during the presidential election that we had in our manifesto had to do with building these networks abroad and getting them back integrated into our economy. So it's got way more potential than people realize, because the reality is that when a Sri Lankan comes back to Sri Lanka from abroad, they're not just, like I said, bringing back expertise. They have a whole network there, right? If they had worked 20, 30 years in a major organization, that network is there. And they can help bring that, because at the end of the day, if there is a network, people will take advantage of it. That's a natural thing that happens in society. When if I needed help from a journalist, I have a network here. Similarly, if someone's coming from the States and they're setting up a technology company here, they have the network. If there's a gap that needs to be filled, they can fill that gap. But even with all these advantages, I just think that if the governments, and I'm not just mentioning this government, successive governments, as you mentioned, we haven't set a level playing field. No, there still, you need to have some network locally. You need to have some privilege here. You need to be from a certain background. Otherwise, doors are shut. And then you have to go through the back door, where it's bribes, it's about who you know, it's about who you went to school with. So I think if you show people there's a level playing field, that it doesn't matter what your surname is, it doesn't matter what school you went to, or all those things, I think people will, because Sri Lankans also, we understand that we have something special here. I mean, end of the day, most of us are here because apart from, of course, the food and the culture, we know it's our home, and it's a very comfortable. A lot of people, not everywhere in Southeast Asia is like this. And I think if you go on social media, you see these stories of people traveling to Sri Lanka and Colombo, and they are saying, oh, it's so clean here, people are nice, and they're really surprised, because most of Southeast Asia isn't like this. Maybe that's partly because of underdevelopment, but there is something in our culture that is unique for whatever reason. So we have to take advantage of that, but at the same time, you can't expect it to happen automatically. You have to set the rules, you have to set the standard. So all you can expect from a state is to ensure that people have some reason to come back, not a reason to keep away, which is what's happening, right? So gun violence, the drug crime, the container fiasco, the institutions. We mentioned institutions, and the fact that we went ahead with this, the government went ahead with the change in the Treasury Secretary. I think it's amazing that that didn't get more pushback, even from my own party. Because honestly, I mean, with all due respect to Dr. Harshan Suryaperuma, the current Treasury Secretary, he's not a member of the civil service. He's never served in the finance ministry. He's never been in the National Planning Department. Just go back and look at some of our previous Treasury Secretaries. They were people who were technocrats. They were from that department. Of course, since the 90s, we've seen a steady deterioration in that post. But even now, we know, for example, the governor of the central bank during the crisis, we know that office is politicized. And the politicization of that office contributed to our economic collapse. No one can deny that. That's just a fact. I mean,
Absolutely.
It's not my opinion. That's a fact.
The Supreme Court has ruled on this, and the central bank governors were faulted.
Yeah, it's not. I'm a member of the SJB, so I'm giving some partisan speech. But okay, Supreme Court also agrees with this, right? So in the same way, it's nothing against Mr. Suryaperuma, Dr. Suryaperuma, absolutely nothing. But he's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for him to take this role, and it's not appropriate for the government to appoint him. He was the deputy finance minister to the finance minister, who is also the president. So that in itself shows that there is they're not even pretending to have a check and a balance in this system, right? Because they've just thought, we are the government, we have 160. If you have a big majority, you don't need to control all these arms of government, right? You can have a lifetime career civil servant in that position and pass whatever legislation you want with your majority. But it seems that they want to have both sides of this, which is a little bit disconcerting.
You think it sets a bad precedent?
It's also just against the system, because in the UK, for instance, do you know who the permanent secretary is to the UK Treasury? His name is James Bowler. No one's heard of him, right? There's no reason for you to know that. I only know that because I saw his name in the papers about 3 months ago, and I noted it down. Because I realized this is something that you just never know. In Sri Lanka, because of a financial collapse, everybody knew Mahinda Sirivaradhana's name. But prior to our collapse, did anybody care who the Treasury Secretary was? Not really. Maybe when it was P.B. Jayasundara, or maybe when it was Mr. Charithra Rathat, maybe that was the time people cared about it. Again, because those were politicized appointments. before Mr. Ratwatta, I believe it was Mr. S. Jayawardena. Mr. S. Jayawardena is a career civil servant, a top economist in the country, former governor of the central bank, and a Harvard graduate. Completely the right profile for that position. You can't say that about any of the more recent appointees.
Now, all this again brings us back to the central question: how do we get the country out of this? Because the clock is ticking, and when I say the clock is ticking, I don't mean politically, but the longer a person stays in poverty, doesn't get the opportunity to go to a new job, a better paying job, and his or her family can be uplifted a bit more. The longer that takes, the more they lose hope. And that's why many people leave the country. But then there are the social ramifications. If they don't leave but they stay, well, anything can happen.
So, since you introduced me as a special advisor for the SJB, I'll make a slightly political statement. Right now, it's been several months of this new government, and this is something I had sort of suspected, but now I've been proven right. Before this government came in, I suggested that the SJB was the only political party that had an economic platform that goes beyond the IMF. Now, the NPP on paper at the time had economic policy platform that went beyond the IMF. It no longer has that. So currently, the SJB is the only political party in parliament that has an economic plan and an agenda that goes beyond the IMF. Our program was always about plugging into global value chains and about becoming an export-oriented industrialized economy. If it was the SJB government in power right now, almost all of our economic policies would be targeted towards attracting major technology manufacturers to Sri Lanka. And that could be a 5-year process, it could have been a 10-year process, but it would have started now. It would have started yesterday, right? And the idea is that if we don't start now, it will never happen. Because it's not... Today, Vietnam is part of the global semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, right? This is Vietnam. When I was growing up, I could only see movies about Vietnam where they were getting bombed by the United States. All you knew about Vietnam in the 90s was that there was a Vietnam War about 10 years before. Today, that's not Vietnam. Right? Today, Vietnam is known as one of America's largest trading partners, right? It's one of the key economies in the world's technology supply chain. And now they're going into the next phase, the highest phase, which is semiconductor manufacturing. So there is no reason, if people think it's some law of physics that Sri Lanka will never get there. With that kind of attitude, we will really never get there. But the fact of the matter is, every country has managed to do this. That's succeeded, they have managed to do it. And whether it's a country with 50, 60 million people like South Korea, whether it's a small island like Singapore with 5 million people, whether it's a country with a very powerful neighbor like Taiwan, none of these things are excuses. Sri Lanka, there is enough of policies our policymakers can learn from. The SJB had a platform that we had a policy plan that basically arranged our economy around trying to get high-tech manufacturers to set up shop in Sri Lanka. It requires us to liberalize trade. It requires us to sign up to the RCEP and ASEAN trade pacts. Some of this stuff will take 2-3 years, but we need to start now. We haven't even taken the opportunity of the Trump tariffs to reorganize our global trade and trade liberalization. So that shows, it proves to me that this government doesn't actually have a roadmap to develop our export sector. And unless we do that, I don't think we'll get anywhere.
Now, however, Kusum, over 3 consecutive elections, the SJP was unable to convince the voters that it should be the party to take the country forward. Now, there is supposed to be a 4th election, the provincial council election. Well, it has not been announced, and we wonder if it will happen. But let's give the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume it will happen sometime next year. Is the SJB seriously looking at it? Or will it be just another okay, NPP is going to win that one as well?
Let me answer your question in this way, Niresh. I think we can all agree that the Aragala and the 2022 economic collapse was a paradigm shift in our political center, right? The reason that the NPP and the JVP are in power is not just because AKD is a very charismatic person, right? AKD is a very charismatic politician. I have written about this. I have articles about this. I think he's a very talented politician. But you can't claim that the NPP would be in power if it weren't for the economic collapse. So I just want to point out to the audience at home, there's only one politician in Sri Lanka that got 4.5 million votes, both before the Aragala and after the Aragala. It's Anil Kumar Dissanayake didn't do it. Ranil Wickremesinghe didn't do it. None of the other presidential candidates did it. Sajith Premadasa earned 5-something million votes before the Aragala. And even after the Aragala, when everyone said the Aragala was against him, he's not popular, he's not going to make, he still received 4.5 million votes, and he outperformed the party at the general election. Now, I agree, I have been critical of my party plenty, maybe more critical than some other people. But I still believe that this is the party with the plan. This is the only party with the individuals that can implement a plan. And the fact of the matter is, Niresh, the SJB's economic plan is far more, shall we say, detailed than anything the NPP has put out. And I think that's showing right now. So to answer your question, liberal parties like the SJB will always struggle in Sri Lanka. The UNP in my lifetime has barely won an election on its own. I don't think it's ever won an election on its own in my lifetime. I'm struggling to think of one, right? So, and the SJB is a breakaway from the UNP, and the UNP operates as if it is completely against the SJB's foundational principles, which technically should be the same as the UNP, but the UNP isn't coalescing around the SJB. There are opposite sides as well. So with the splintering of the political center, the SJB has found itself in trouble. And the other thing is that the SJB is a centrist party. We have to accept. It's a centrist party that can go either way, left or right. So my opinion on this is that it's not about being centrism in the way of a Tony Blair or a Bill Clinton, which is what's called third way centrism. You have to be a progressive centrist, where you have to take the ideas of both left and right and find a way to provide solutions to the people. And in that sense, I think some of the policy platform that we put forward during the presidential election took into consideration both left and right. On the contrary, the NPP, they seem to be in the middle of nowhere. They're neither left nor right. They're not investing in health, education, and social assistance, nor are they liberalizing the economy. They're not reducing the number of state-run employees, nor are they privatizing SOEs. Sri Lankan Airlines, we took on $500 million of debt from the state banks. It's no longer being privatized, and they've put a member of Haley's as the chairman. There's ongoing concentrations of power. They don't seem like a serious administration when it comes to economic management.
Now, Kusum, you spoke of a paradigm shift. Now, paradigm shifts happen all the time, and I would venture to say that paradigm shifts are the reason that different political parties, ruling parties, get chucked out of power. We've seen it in 1970 when Radley Senayaka was defeated. Then in 77, again, paradigm shift, because the people feel the government didn't perform. And then again, 1994, and so on and so forth. And with the Aragale, again, same thing. So we now have the NPP. Are you expecting a paradigm shift again?
Niresh, I think we have to, let's compare to Yahapalnya. If you say Yahapalnya government's victory over the Rajapaksas in 2015 was also a paradigm shift, I can agree. But then you have to appreciate the difference in intensity. The situation of the country in 2015 wasn't great, but it's extremely different to what it was in 2022. So that intensity also matters. Now, why I said a paradigm shift was the political center in Sri Lanka shifted. In whatever way, it's changed. What people look for has changed. That's why a lot of politicians didn't even make it to parliament, who have been in parliament for 20, 30 years. So my point is that if there's
I think that was the part of the problem.
That was part of the problem. So even in the midst of a paradigm shift, the SJB and its leader in particular have been fairly stable. There is a block of support there. Growing that support is going to be the challenge. Now, I think during the presidential election, we faltered. We tried to do it the old way, where we invited people from other parties onto our platforms, and we tried coalition building with some of the people that we felt were, better off than the others. That didn't work. So going forward, I hope that the SJB will learn the lessons from previous defeats, because certainly if you don't learn the lessons, whatever paradigm shift happens, you'll get trampled under that shift.
Right, and I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Kusum Wijetilleke from the SJB, who is the special advisor on political economy to the leader of the SJB. Thank you very much for being with us once again, Kusum.
Thanks for having me, Naresh. Appreciate it.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.